Welcome back to Digital Businesses series Ahead of the Curve Business Talks. My name is Jaren Lewis and I'm delighted to be your host. Ahead of the Curve is a show for ambitious business professionals who want to keep up to date with what's happening in the business world, get more out of their businesses, and stay ahead of their competition. I'm going to be coming to you right here every month as we explore what it takes to build a successful company that is, you guessed it, always ahead of the curve. Now this month, our topic of choice is how to manage your cash flow to grow your business. And we have one of the best finance thought leaders in the region to talk about business money matters. And that's Mr. Gary Peart, Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of Mayberry Investments Limited. Gary has over 20 years of corporate finance experience in the Jamaican financial industry. He was first appointed to the board of directors of Mayberry in April 2006 and was then appointed chairman of Supreme Ventures Limited in 2019. He's also a director on several other boards, including Lasco Financial Services Limited, Lasco Distributors Limited, and Iron Rock Insurance Company Limited. With that kind of experience, it's no surprise that Gary has been honored by several organizations and was named top CEO in Jamaica in 2015. Gary, welcome to the show. It's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
So, I really want to start things off by talking about cash flow. As we know, cash is king in business, particularly in this region. Plus, it's been, a very, very unique 18 months to say the least. So I'd love to hear, coming out of the last year and a half or so, what trends you've seen emerging across the Caribbean in terms of businesses being able to or not being able to manage their cash flow.
Well, the trends I've seen is that people have gotten closer and to better understand the cash flow of their businesses. Because one of the things I find, a lot of people did not really understand what a cash flow was. Just simply speaking, to identify all the sources of cash coming into the business, and net that off against all the cash that is going out. So what I found is that prior to COVID, the people didn't really pay very close attention to it. Yeah. But since COVID, everybody seems to know where every dollar is hidden in their business. And I think the biggest thing, which is a focus on one side, is really on the payable side, i.e. the monies that you owe people. I find that more and more companies are trying to, for want of a better word, stretch their payments to you. And, there's been kind of pushback because that game, you have to collect and then you have to pay. And people are trying to find ways in which I can reduce the collection cycle, but whilst increasing the payment cycle.
Right. Completely understandable. And speaking to that cash flow process, are there any companies you think you look at and you go, they have done this particularly well?
Mm-hmm. There are lots of them, and obviously the companies that benefited in COVID were primarily the food companies. And, so they were able to get a lot of cash from the retail side of stuff. So companies like supermarkets, they've done extremely well. The distribution companies have done a little bit better because they're selling to the supermarkets, but then there's that payment cycle. So the conglomerates, so Grace Kennedy, Neil and Massey, when you look on their balance sheet, you'd have seen that they've been able to really manage it pretty well. Especially at Grace Kennedy, that also has remittances. So remittances picked up during the period. So they would have benefited from not having local cash flows, but international cash flows in US dollars, pounds, etc. So those are two companies I think that have done pretty well. There are other local companies here in Jamaica, with Cinco, etc., that didn't do too badly themselves.
Right, that's very interesting. And so I know in your line of work, you must see lots of businesses make mistakes as well. So we talked about the good side of it, but are there common cash flow mistakes that you see made in your day-to-day operations or in other companies' day-to-day operations? And as an extension to that, are there any that you see businesses repeating over and over again?
Yeah, as simple as it sounds, the biggest one are there are a lot of businesses who don't realize sales is not profit. So your sales is your inventory turn. So I find that in medium to small businesses. So let's say you're selling $100 million a year, but you're turning your inventory 10 times. So your capital is really 10 million, which you've turned 10 times to get 100 million in sales. And I've seen owners say they're taking out $1 million to do something else, not realizing the impact on your sales is going to be that $1 million time the inventory turnover. So when the sales drop $10 million, they're like, what has happened, right? And that's in a good case. Unfortunately, some people see 100 million in sales and take out $5 million, not realizing the impact on sales is going to be $50 million. So that's one which is pretty common in medium and very small businesses. People coming into business, they don't realize that. Another one is volume of payments. And again, what you find is that over time, business owners or business executives focus on larger volume of payments. And sometimes they lose focus on the frequency of those payments. So they create a structure that says, okay, fine, if I'm going to buy a piece of equipment, that's a million TT or a million Jamaican dollars, they track that, but they might miss something that is a $10,000 payment, but you're doing that 100 times for the month. Because when you calculate it, it becomes a much bigger number. And so they're watching the inflow, not picking up on these small outflows. And then obviously you end up having to get financing from a financial institution, etc., not knowing that this is something you can control.
Right. And so we spoke about, you spoke a little bit about businesses and across a year how they would conduct business. But there are some types of business in my mind that are cyclical, so they would have ups and downs.
Yeah.
How would one of those businesses prepare for those slow periods during those highs?
Well, there are a combination of factors. So I think an example of a business like that is a project type business that's putting in, for example, specialized equipment. So it depends. The first thing you do is how you structure your mandate. So you know that you're installing, let's use an example, a utility company. We're going to install a power plant. Yeah. So it's going to take 2 years to install a power plant. Or for the example, that you're going to take a year to install a power plant. You have purchases to make, you have labor to pay. So when you're structuring that contract, you have to structure it in a way where it matches the peak of your outflows. You have some people who don't do that. And then what happens is, depending on the nature of the contract, it might be their responsibility to buy the piece of equipment, right? And they thought they had sufficient cash flow, but when you bought the piece of equipment, you realize, oh, you need to install it, and you don't have the cash flow to pay for the labor. So you have a wad of cash that you're getting at the end of a project, because that's how projects are structured. They give you payments along the way, and you might have mismanaged how the payment should be. Invariably, you would have to either go back to a bank to get short-term financing to fill that gap, which is usually what most people do. Depending on the size, you have some people that would go and get equity from a partner, a friend, a venture capital company, again, depending on what the numbers are. But usually that's where you would see that type of thing, a project type scenario where the payments are, the structure of it itself is lumpy. And the best way to resolve that is, as I said, I'm kind of repeating myself, is to structure your payment schedule in a way to match your outgoings.
Right. So when it comes to that cash flow, because we're talking about, for example, this project-based business, and when it comes to that cash flow projection and planning, other than some of the things that you mentioned, what would you say are best practices to have that peace of mind when it comes to cash flow?
Well, like with most things in business, which I think the best businesses do, they get as granular as possible. So you have a lot of people who feel that certain things are just too small and you just don't focus on it. But what you find, the businesses that are very good at modeling cash flows are those that go right down to the base of it. So what do I mean by that? I've seen people who have cash flows on a daily basis for going on 2, 3 years, but which is good. But I've seen people who, in addition to having it on a daily basis, they have it down to an hourly basis because the banks close at a particular time in the day. So here in Jamaica, once you get around 1, 2 o'clock, you can't make deposits for value same day. So some people's cash flow is as granular as that to say, okay, fine, if you don't collect this before this time, it's going to show on the next day. So on their cash flow, even though you receive it today, the 17th, it actually doesn't show on the cash flow until the morning of the 18th, because when you receive it in the evening of the 17th, you can't lodge it. Yeah.
Right.
So those are that's an example of the best practices. There are a lot of people who automate it because the business gets bigger. They're more detailed, especially when you get very granular. And then the things that people talk a lot about is you want a very good payables manager. Obviously, if somebody gives you 7 days and you can pay on day 8, that's an extra day interest free. Obviously, day 14, day 21 is even better. Yeah. But those techniques are known by a lot of different people. And then also, I mean, on the inflow side, you have some companies that will give you an incentive to pay early. So, for example, here in Jamaica, the utility company, the light company, or the water company will pay you some monies if you pay your light bill or your water bill X number of days before the due date. So you can use initiatives like that to bring in your cash. And then ultimately, the other things that I think most people would know, you can actually go the route of actually getting into a relationship with a financing house to discount your receivables and get cash upfront. Depends. So there are different levels you go. I think as a business, you start with the granularity and understanding those things that can impact how you collect. And there's even training, because what you find is that, as simple as the bearer, you can have a bearer that collects your check at 9 o'clock in the morning and he does his work for the whole day and he carries it to you at 5 o'clock in the evening. You're like, really? So there's a certain level of training so that at all categories of the business, that this is importance of these things. So that those are some small details that a lot of people overlook. But something like your bearer who's out there collecting your funds, they must understand the importance of getting it in by a certain time as well.
I want to just circle back to something that you said just now, in the example you used of the power company,
Yes.
and them speeding up their cash inflow. Would you say, from your point of view, that is a good practice when it comes to managing your cash flow?
The answer is yes, because at the end of the day in a business, everything is about the net effect, right? So if I am owed, let's use a round number. If I'm owed $100 million and my overdraft charge is 10%, yeah, I'm gonna pay $1 million in overdraft if I don't get the cash in. I mean, when it's overdraft where you're going and negotiate a new loan, it's $1 million in interest or fees or whatever you want to call it, right? So if I look on and I say, hey, how else can I get this 100 million in without accessing these facilities? And once it's less than $1 million, it makes a lot of sense. So if I offer my customer net 100 grand to pay me early and I get 100 million earlier, so I don't have to access the line, it's 100,000 versus $1 million. Yeah.
Right.
So any initiative like that, that net puts me in a better position, is something that as a business you have to look at, right? And I've found the innovative and the great companies out there find different ways in which to achieve these objectives.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I know obviously there's multiple layers to managing your cash flow. But if you could pick one great cash flow habit that distinguishes a great company from just a good one, Um, what would you say that is?
Granularity. A great company, no matter how big, knows where every single dollar is coming from and going at any time of the day, any time of the year, any time of the month. You have whoever is in charge of that can look at you and can tell you. So, and because that's how businesses are run. I'm going to get an opportunity tomorrow morning. I'm going to go to my CFO and say, hey, I need to buy something. My CFO, if he's a really, really good at managing my cash flow, can immediately say to me, hey, this is the amount you can afford to spend right now. Because I know where to find that cash. And if it's something bigger than that, this is what we'd have to go to the bank for. And you can get that in 5 or 10 minutes, which helps makes a particular decision that much better. And that gives you the confidence as a leader in a business that the person you have in charge fully understands what's going on. Because it don't matter how big or small your company is, if you go to that person in charge and you ask a question, as inane as the question is, and they can say, oh, yeah. The uniform payment is due this afternoon, and it is for 53 employees in this subsidiary down in Guyana at this point in time in this exchange rate, and this is all right. You got it. You got it.
I got you. I got you. So look, I want to pivot a little bit from the cash flow discussion, right? There's many ways and I want to talk about capital a little bit. There's
Yeah.
many ways in which businesses can raise capital. I mean, you can use your personal funds, you can attract investors, you can go to the bank. More recently, we've seen things like crowdfunding. In this time and in this climate, would you say that one of those or two of those methods are more sensible than the others? What would be your preference?
My preference, take longer to pay my supplier. That's the cheapest form of financing. Coming back to the cash flow, I mean, once you speak to it as capital, if you have someone that manages your cash flow well, they can actually generate capital for you. So, I mean, I remember doing a project for an entity, and I've never seen anything like this. Their head of payables was able to convince suppliers to wait 190 days for payment. It was amazing. I'm like, that's like interest free, not even just interest free. They're paying you interest for capital.
Yeah.
And if you have a large company and you're selling in 7 days and paying in 180 days, I mean, that's phenomenal. Yeah. So I know that's not really the answer you're really looking for on the capital side. But I say that as an example to tell you that's the cheapest way to do it. And ultimately, the answer to your question is a function of the ultimate cost to you as the owner. So the most expensive way to raise fund is by giving equity, because equity is into perpetuity. So the moment you sell equity, you can never find something more expensive than that, because you're getting share of profits into perpetuity, right? But for some people, they prefer to share that risk as opposed to paying the interest cost of that, right? Then that's when you come in the next level down into bank financing, mezzanine financing, that those kind of complex ways of doing stuff. So it really matters. What really matters is how your business is structured. So if you have a business that generates a lot of cash, then it might make sense for you to take debt and expand by debt. Because in a relatively short time, you can pay the interest, pay the debt, and you preserve your equity. But if it's a business that has cash gaps, then it's better to use equity, because it gets you over the gap and then also helps you to reduce the risk potentially associated with your business blowing up, if you can't cross that gap.
Right. And so it might sound like a silly question, but
There are no
is
silly
there a
questions.
time is there a time when raising funds is not a good idea? Is there any particular scenario in the business world where trying to raise funds might do more damage than good?
Yeah. Fundamentally, people are raising equity. for ideally to grow. Yeah. If you're raising equity just to survive, then that might not necessarily be a good idea, right? Because, in a different way, somebody had asked a question, when to give up the ship,
Yeah.
right? So there's a technique to that. Um, the easiest answer to that question is if it's not only in your head in terms of the potential of your business. And what do I mean by that? Every business owner believes that their business is going to be the biggest thing in the world, right? Just given it enough time, right? But if it can be empirically calculated that this business has real potential that can be extracted, yeah, then it might not serve you to raise capital before a certain point in time because you're giving away a certain amount of value before time, right? And so, and the same goes for debt. There you might want to enter into certain transactions, and your business is not ready for it. Your employees are not ready for that kind of move, etc. So you raise the capital, you want to go into that field, and it not only can damage the acquisition, but ultimately damage the existing businesses. Yeah, but in terms of where I think you're asking the question from, the simple answer to that is if you feel or it is shown that the business is going to be 50 times bigger in a year, what's the point in selling 50% of the business for equity now at a valuation? In other words, if I value the business today and it's valued $10 million, but in 2 years, I believe it's going to be valued 100 or $300 billion, then why would I sell now? I would try and raise debt and bridge the gap, then sell once we see that potential coming through.
Excellent. And when would you say business owners should consider seeking external sources of capital if there aren't other funding options available to them?
Well, ultimately, a business is growing, eh? And when you start seeing things like inventory stockouts, when you start to see your customers clamoring for more goods, and you just can't produce it, you can't sell it, etc. You're maxing out, and that's not a good thing because the customer is going to go somewhere else until they find it. They will not sit down every day waiting for you to get to that point in time. And I think that's usually the clearest sign that you need to do more. So if you're producing 10 bottles and your customers are demanding 1,000 bottles, here's an opportunity for you to say, okay, am I making enough profits to expand to 20 bottles? But if you go to 20 bottles and the demand is for 1,000 bottles, then should I consider taking external capital to go to 500 bottles or to go to 100 bottles? Yeah. And that's a very simplistic way to give you an example of how to look at it, but in more complex businesses, there are different levels that you would look at. And usually in bigger businesses, you're looking at the growth rate of different markets, and you compare that to the growth rate of your organic growth in profits, sales, etc. And if you see a gap there, that also is a sign that you need to fill it by taking external financing.
Right. And I'll ask my next question with our small business viewers in mind. But in particular, sorry, for a small business, speaking from your experience, what is the most difficult part in them raising capital or raising investment?
In my experience, a lot of small businesses don't have proper financial statements. And I find that to be one of the biggest issues because usually in a small business, the promoter, the owner, whatever you want to call that person, covers a lot of different roles because they're trying to keep expenses as small as possible. And so what that does is you don't necessarily have an accounting department. B, you don't necessarily have proper accounting records, even if you're going to outsource it. And all of that impacts the quality of the financial statements. So ultimately what happens is that every small business can become a big business tomorrow. But every time you move to grow, you need somebody to assess where you are. And the only way we can assess it is with financial statements. And so, yes, you're trying to save the money, but ultimately it can cost you money because there's no way the financier can assess what you're doing. And we're just not going to take your word, right? So I find that to be the biggest issue, and I understand it because they will say to you, we don't have the money to pay a big name audit firm, which we know who they are, to do X, Y, and Z. So they're gonna try and find a little guy around the corner that just got qualified, and we're like, well, we don't know, So you get a set of accounts that's not IFRS compliant, la da da, etc. But there's always a middle ground. Usually, what I find is that if it's a business that is poised for tremendous growth, I find that they normally have an owner or a set of owners behind it that recognizes that. And then we find a way to bridge the gap to get to proper financials.
Right. And on that note, have you come across or encountered any unique fundraising ideas for startup businesses?
Yeah, there's several of them. As I said, venture capital is where you get all the exciting ways in which to do it. I think most of the ideas revolve around an equity type scenario. So you have people that will put in the funds initially as debt, but at a certain point, once you hit certain triggers, it converts to equity. I've seen the reverse. You take equity now, but then once the business does what it wants, they allow the initial seller to buy back some of the equity. You've seen stuff where you using venture financing, use a bunch of different ways in which to give the owner some amount of benefit, and then in return you get equity at a predetermined price ratio, etc. Down the road. So there's mezzanine type financing. There are a variety of different ways of getting the financing. But never forget, the conversation only starts if you put in front of the financier a business that has significant potential. So you can't get around that side of it, right? So always focus on that. You carry something that has significant upside potential, I guarantee you, there is some financier out there that will find a way to make it work.
No, I know you have a lot of experience with angel investors and other types of startup financiers. What conclusions have you drawn in your time about these types of financing or these sources of financing?
It's necessary. The world cannot exist without them. You name the company, it started as a relatively small company. So you can never turn a blind eye to an idea because this idea can change into something that is huge. Remember when Amazon came out, Amazon is an online bookstore, right? And look at what they've morphed into to become one of the biggest, baddest companies on the planet right now. And it is growing in so many different directions. They now have their own airline fleet. And we can talk forever on what Amazon is trying to do. So I think it is very, very important, the ability to finance some of these smaller companies, because at the root of a small company is an idea that can change the world. It's an idea that is held by the promoter that says, let me monetize this idea. And it's an idea that probably in some instances, the majority of people in the world have never thought of until he has put it forward. So having a way in which to bring that to fruition is always going to be important, because if you don't have it, then the world ultimately does not become exposed to that idea and ultimately the benefits associated with it. But I always say to people, I mean, there are 6 billion ideas every day. you know. So that idea that is going to change the world, don't feel it's sitting on a tree waiting for you.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful sentiment. And so I think as my last question, I want to keep in mind the entrepreneurs we have looking in at this discussion right now. And those in particular who would have a need for a temporary injection of cash into their businesses because they're having a tough time. Uh, can you maybe leave those guys with some advice from you?
Um, you know, I'll give this advice in two different ways. The first one is whether COVID or no COVID, meaning if we didn't have a COVID, because there'll always be something. Try and have as best a possible relationship with financiers. That's one. Two, try and meet as many of them as is possible. And try as best as possible to let them understand your business, right? Because I find a lot of people don't like to speak about their business. And I find that it's mainly people with small businesses that don't like to speak about it because they feel people will steal their idea. But what they don't know is a lot of medium and large businesses speak to financiers almost daily about their business. Because once a financier understands your business, it makes it easier for them to give you financing. So I use that background to say to you, if that is your ethos, if you hit upon an issue, it doesn't have to be COVID. It can be anything, death in the family, somebody steal your goods, whatever it wants to be. When you approach them, they'll be more minded to say, hey, let me give you a temporary structure under certain things because they understand what your business was. And more importantly, they would have seen what your business did in the past. So therefore, it's an easier decision for them to say, hey, we're doing a special financing, a special structure because we understand it. Yeah. So it's like when the sun is shining, you know, put away your acorns because when the flood is coming, there'll be none to collect, right? But on a different level. Because what I find is that you have a lot of small businesses that keeps everything tight to themselves. And then when they run into trouble, that's when they're trying to find support. And usually, even if somebody would be willing to support them, the time and effort it's going to take to understand it, they don't really take it on. Yeah. Obviously, the next level is the government. You know, what I find is that they, especially in the region, the governments in the region, you know, paid attention certainly to smaller businesses or you know, poorer people. And they have a variety of different facilities that help to assist. Um, Again, I find that you had some smaller businesses that, you know, the pride, they didn't want to go and take it because they feel it's a handout, whatever it wants to be. But there are certain facilities out there that can benefit the smaller businessmen that a lot of them are not aware of. And again, it's such a paradox because large businesses actually have a department that all they do is to scan the local and international arena for these types of things so they can participate. But then the people who truly and really need it, the smaller businessman, wants to keep it quiet and don't want to talk to anybody, right? So that's key because I've found in a lot of instances there are facilities that are sitting there that the small business people just did not take the time to investigate. And it, you know, at a time like this, it's an opportunity to go there. You know, I close the answer by saying this. You know, our local stock exchange has a competition for venture capital money. So you come and you pitch an idea, etc. You know, and some guys are like, "Oh, I'm not going to do that. That's just $100,000." It's a pandemic, buddy. You know, something as simple as that. Like, hey, part the ego, man. You go and bid for that. They get 100,000. You not get 100,000 from somewhere. You know, and so it's stuff like that. There are people that might have the ability to assist you, and a small business owner has an ego issue and is like, well, I'm not going to go to Gary because, you know, he knows this, and then they're going to realize this is a problem. Nah, you know, coming out of COVID, there are a lot of people who they're not a lot, but there is a segment of businesses that did well. And again, in the region, I'm seeing where a lot of them have gotten into a lot of M&A and straight out acquisitions because they realize that there are businesses there that need assistance. So that is also there. You can reach out to these bigger companies and, you know, they might look on you in a different way. And then finally, how we started. if your supplier can allow you additional days, and this is now the reverse of what I said earlier. If your supplier gives you 30 days to pay, can you then go to the supplier and say, hey, what's the cost for you not getting your payment a week or a month out? Let's say they say 1%. Volunteer to pay the cost. Yeah, because it gives you more time to pay the principal. Yeah. So if you're paying the 1%, you still have the 99% that you can sell goods and then come back and pay them. Yeah. There's so many other things that we could discuss, but I think the central theme is you as a business owner needs to have a key set of stakeholders that you're in constant communication with on your business. Whether healthy or unhealthy, they need to know because they're your lifeline, whether it's a pandemic or it's not a pandemic.
Gary, I'll tell you what, I'm actually blown away by how refreshing and informative this conversation has been. You might even make an entrepreneur out of me yet, and you'll definitely make better ones of our viewers for sure. Thank you so much for imparting your knowledge and taking the time to be here with us today.
You're welcome, and thank you for inviting me. If people like yourself didn't invite me, I wouldn't have been able to help at least one person, and I try to help a lot of people every day.
Thanks so much, Gary. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there for today. But before we go, I want to take a moment to say a big thank you for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thanks again to you, our viewers. We hope you've enjoyed this month's episode of Ahead of the Curve Business Talks. And I'll see you back here next month for our next information-packed installment. Thanks again for tuning into today's show. See you soon as we continue Ahead of the Curve Business Talks.